Konnichiwa, minasan. This is Wakizashi coming to you from the Teahouse over in Japan. Today I want to read from Snow Country. It's a famous Japanese novel by Yasunori Kawabata. First of all, I want to read a little bit of the introduction and then I'm going to read the first few pages. So, to set the scene, in the winter, cold winds blow down from Siberia, pick up moisture over the Japan Sea and drop it as snow when they strike the mountains of Japan. The west coast of the main island of Japan is probably, for its latitude, the snowiest region in the world. From December to April or May, only the railroads are open, and the snow in the mountains is sometimes as much as 15 feet deep. The expression snow country, then, does not mean simply country where snow falls. It means very specifically the part of the main island that lies west of the central mountain range. It suggests long grey winters, tunnels under the snow, dark houses with rafters black from the smoke of winter braze fires, and perhaps chilblains, or to the more imaginative, life divorced from time through the long snowbound months. The hot springs, one of which is the locale of Snow Country, also have a peculiarly Japanese significance. The Japanese seldom goes to a hot spring for his health, and he never goes for the season, as people once went to Bath. He may ski or view maple leaves or cherry blossoms, but his wife is usually not with him. The special delights of the hot spring are for the unaccompanied gentleman. No prosperous hot spring is without its geisha and its compliant hotel maids. If the hot spring geisha is not a... It's true that sometimes she marries an old guest. And don't forget, this was written back in 1948, so it's got that kind of sensibilities to it. Okay, let's skip ahead to the first page. Here we go. It's a snowy night here in Japan, so I think having some problems with the connection. There's a snowstorm blowing outside at the moment. So anyway, let's continue with the book. Part 1. The train came out of the long tunnel into the snow country. The earth lay white under the night sky. The train pulled up at a signal stop. A girl who had been sitting on the other side of the car came over and opened the window in front of Shimamura. The snowy cold poured in. Leaning far out of the window, the girl called to the station master as though he were a great distance away. The station master walked slowly over the snow, a lantern in his hand. His face was buried to the nose in a muffler, and the flaps of his cap were turned down over his ears. "It's that cold, is it?" thought Shimamura. Low, barrack-like buildings that might have been railway dormitories were scattered, here and there, up the frozen slope of the mountain. The white of the snow fell away into the darkness, some distance before it reached them. "How are you?" the girl called out. "It's Yoko." "Yoko, is it? On your way back? It's gotten cold again." "I understand my brother has come to work here. Thank you for all you've done." "It will be lovely, though. This is no place for a young boy." "He's really no more than a child. You'll teach him what he needs to know, won't you?" "Oh, but he's doing very well. We'll be busier from now on with the snow and all. Last year we had so much that the trains were always being stopped by avalanches, and the whole town was kept busy cooking for them. But look at the warm clothes, would you? My brother said in his letter that he wasn't even wearing a sweater yet. I'm not warm unless I have on 4 layers myself. The young ones start drinking when it gets cold, and the first thing you know, they're over there in bed with colds." He waved his lantern towards the dormitories. "Does my brother drink?" "Not that I know of." "You're on your way home then, are you?" "I had a little accident. I've been going on to the doctor." "You must be more careful." The station master, who had an overcoat on over his kimono, turned as if to cut the freezing conversation short. "Take care of yourself," he called over his shoulder. "Is my brother here now?" Yoko looked out over the snow-covered platform. "See that he behaves himself. It was such a beautiful voice that it struck one as sad. In all its high resonance, it seemed to come echoing back across the snowy night. The girl was still leaning out the window when the train pulled away from the station. "Tell my brother to come home when he has a holiday," she called out to the station master, who was walking along the tracks. "I'll tell him," the man called back. Yoko closed the window and pressed her hands to her red cheeks. 3 snowplows were waiting for the heavy snows here on the border range. There was an electric avalanche warning system at the north and south entrances to the tunnel. 5,000 workers were ready to clear away the snow, and 2,000 young men from the volunteer fire departments could be mobilized if they were needed. Yoko's brother would be working at this signal stop, so soon to be buried under the snow. Somehow, that fact made the girl more interesting to Shimamura. The girl. Something in her manner suggested the unmarried girl. Shimamura, of course, had no way of being sure what her relationship was to the man with her. They acted rather like a married couple. The man was clearly ill, however, and illness shortens the distance between a man and a woman. The more earnest the ministrations, the more the two come to seem like husband and wife. A girl taking care of a man far older than she, for all the world like a young mother, can from a distance be taken for his wife. But Shimamura in his mind had cut the girl off from the man with her and decided from her general appearance and manner that she was unmarried. And then, because he had been looking at her from a strange angle for so long, emotions, peculiarly his own, had perhaps coloured his judgment. It had been 3 hours earlier. In his boredom, Shimamura stared at his left hand as the forefinger bent and unbent. Only this hand seemed to have a vital and immediate memory of the woman he was going to see. The more he tried to call up a clear picture of her, the more his memory failed him. The farther she faded away, leaving him nothing to catch and hold. In the midst of this uncertainty, only the one hand, and in particular the forefinger, even now seemed damp from her touch, seemed to be pulling him back to her from afar. Taken with the strangeness of it, he brought the hand to his face, then quickly drew a line across the misted over window. A woman's eye floated up before him. He almost called out in his astonishment, but he had been dreaming, and when he came to himself, he saw that it was only the reflection in the window of the girl opposite. Outside it was growing dark, and the lights had been turned on in the train, transforming the window into a mirror. The mirror had been clouded over with steam until he drew that line across it. The one eye by itself was strangely beautiful, but feigning a traveller's weariness and putting his face to the window as if to look at the scenery outside, he cleared the steam from the rest of the glass. The girl leaned attentively forward, looking down at the man before her. Shimamura could see from the way her strength was gathered in her shoulders that the suggestion of fierceness in her eyes was but a sign of an intentness that did not permit her to blink. The man lay with his head pillowed at the window and his legs bent so that his feet were on the seat facing beside the girl. It was a third-class coach. The pair were not directly opposite Shimamura, but rather one seat forward, and the man's head showed in the window mirror only as far as the ear. Since the girl was thus diagonally opposite him, Shimamura could as well have looked directly at her. When the two of them came on the train, however, something coolly piercing about her beauty had startled Shimamura, and as he hastily lowered his eyes, as he'd seen the man's ashen fingers clutching at the girl's, somehow it seemed wrong to look their way again. The man's face in the mirror suggested the feeling of security and repose it gave him to be able to rest his eyes on the girl's breast. His very weakness lent a certain soft balance and harmony to the two figures. One end of his scarf served as a pillow, and the other end pulled up tight over his mouth, like a mask. It rested on his cheek. Now and then it fell loose or slipped down over his nose, and almost before he had time to signal his annoyance, the girl gently rearranged it. The process was repeated over and over, automatically, so often that Shimamura, watching them, almost found himself growing impatient. Occasionally, the bottom of the overcoat in which the man's feet were wrapped would slip open and fall to the floor, and the girl would quickly pull it back together. It was all completely natural, as if the two of them, quite insensitive to space, meant to go on forever, farther and farther into the distance. For Shimamura, there was none of the pain that the sight of something truly sad can bring. Rather, it was as if he were watching a tableau in a dream, and that was no doubt the working of his strange mirror. In the depths of the mirror, the evening landscape moved by. The mirror and the reflected figures, like motion pictures, superimposed one on the other. The figures and the background were unrelated, and yet the figures, transparent and intangible, and the background, dim in the gathering darkness, melted together into a sort of symbolic world not of this world. Particularly when a light came out in the mountains shone in the centre of the girl's face, Shimamura felt his chest rise at the inexpressible beauty of it. The mountain sky still carried traces of evening red. Individual shapes were clear far into the distance, but the monotonous mountain landscape, undistinguished for mile after mile, seemed all the more undistinguished for having lost its last traces of colour. There was nothing in it to catch the eye, and it seemed to flow along in a wide, unformed emotion. That was, of course, because the girl's face was floating over it. Cut off by the face, the evening landscape moved steadily by around its outlines. The face, too, seemed transparent, but was it really transparent? Shimamura had the illusion that the evening landscape was actually passing over the face, and the flow did not stop to let him be sure it was not. The light inside the train was not particularly strong, and the reflection was not as clear as it would have been in a mirror. Since there were no glare, Shimamura came to forget that it was a mirror he was looking at. The girl's face seemed to be out in the flow of the evening mountains. It was then that a light shone in the face. The reflection in the mirror was not strong enough to blot out the light outside, nor was the light strong enough to dim the reflection. The light moved across the face, though not to light it up. It was a distant, cold light. As it sent its small ray through the pupil of the girl's eye, as the eye and the light were superimposed one on the other, the eye became a weirdly beautiful bit of phosphorescence on the sea of evening mountains. There was no way for Yoko to know that she was being stared at. Her attention was concentrated on the sick man, and even had she looked towards Shimamura, she would probably not have seen her reflection, and she would have paid no attention to the man looking out the window. It did not occur to Shimamura that it was improper to stare at this girl for so long and stealthily. That, too, was no doubt because he was taken by the unreal, otherworldly power of his mirror in the evening landscape. When, therefore, the girl called out to the station master, her manner again suggesting over-earnestness, Shimamura perhaps saw her first of all, as rather like a character out of an old romantic tale. The window was dark by the time they came to the signal stop. The charm of the mirror faded with the fading landscape. Yoko's face was still there, but for all the warmth of her ministrations, Shimamura had found in her a transparent coldness. He did not clear the window as it clouded over again. He was startled then when, a half-hour later, Yoko and the man got off the train at the same station as he. He looked around as though he were about to be drawn into something, but the cold air on the platform made him suddenly ashamed of his rudeness on the train. He crossed the tracks in front of the locomotive without looking back again. The man, clinging to Yoko's shoulder, was about to climb down to the tracks from the platform opposite when from this side a station attendant raised a hand to stop them. A long freight train came out of the darkness to block them from sight. The porter from the inn was so well equipped for the cold that he suggested a fireman. He had on ear flaps and high rubber boots. The woman looking out over the tracks from the waiting room wore a blue cape with a cowl pulled over her head. Shimamura, still warm from the train, was not sure how cold it really was. This was his first taste of the snow country winter, however, and he felt somewhat intimidated. Is it as cold as all that? We're ready for the winter. It's always especially cold the night it clears after a snow. It must be below freezing tonight. This is below freezing, is it? Shimamura looked up at the delicate icicles along the eaves as he climbed into the taxi. The white of the snow made the deep eaves look deeper still, as if everything had sunk quietly into the earth. The cold here is different, though. That's easy to see. It feels different when you touch something. Last year it went down to 0. How much snow? Ordinarily 7 or 8 feet, sometimes as much as 12 or 13, I'd say. The heavy snows come from now on. They're just beginning. We had about a foot, but it's melted down a good bit. It's been melting, has it? We could have a heavy snow almost any time now, though. It was the beginning of December. Shimamura's nose had been stopped up by a stubborn cold, but it cleared to the middle of his head in the cold air and began running as if the matter in it was washing cleanly away. Is the girl who lived with the music teacher still around? She's still around. You didn't see her in the station in the dark blue cape. So that's who it was. We can call her later, I suppose. This evening? This evening. I hear the music teacher's son came back on your train. She was at the station to meet him. The sick man he had watched in that evening mirror, then, was the son of the music teacher in whose house the woman Shimamura had come to see was living. He felt a current pass through him, and yet the coincidence did not seem especially remarkable. Indeed, he was surprised at himself for being so little surprised. Somewhere in his heart, Shimamura saw a question as clearly as if it were standing there before him. Was there something, what would happen, between the woman his hand remembered and the woman in whose eye that mountain light had glowed? Or had he not yet shaken off the spell of the evening landscape in that mirror? He wondered whether the flowing landscape was not perhaps symbolic of the passage of time. The hot spring inn had its fewest guests in the weeks before the skiing season began, and by the time Shimamura had come up from the bath, the place seemed to be asleep. The glass doors rattled slightly each time he took a step down the sagging corridor. At the end, where it turned past the office, he saw the tall figure of the woman, her skirts trailing coldly off across the dark floor. She finally became a geisha. She did not come toward him. She did not bend in the slightest movement of recognition. From the distance he caught something intent and serious in the still form. He hurried up to her, but they said nothing, even when he was beside her. She started to smile through the thick, white geisha's powder. Instead, she melted into tears, and the two of them walked off silently toward his room. In spite of what had passed between them, he had not written to her, or come to see her, or sent her the dance instructions he'd promised. She was no doubt left to think that he had laughed at her and forgotten her. It should therefore have been his part to begin with an apology or an excuse, but as they walked along, not looking at each other, he could tell that, far from blaming him, she had room in her heart only for the pleasure of regaining what had been lost. He knew that if he spoke, he would only make himself seem the more wanting in seriousness. Overpowered by the woman, he walked along wrapped in a soft happiness. Abruptly, at the foot of the stairs, he shoved his left fist before her eyes with only the forefinger extended. This remembered you best of all. Oh? The woman took the finger in her hand and clung to it as though to lead him upstairs. She let go his hand as they came to the kotatsu in his room. The kotatsu is a charcoal brazier covered by a wooden frame and a quilt. Although it warms little more than the hands and feet, the kotatsu is the only heating device in the ordinary Japanese house back in this time. As if to conceal her confusion, she clutched at his hand again. This remembered me? Not the right hand, this. He pushed his right hand into the kotatsu to warm it up, and gave her his left fist with the finger extended. I know. Her face carefully composed, she laughed softly. She opened his hand and pressed her cheek against it. This remembered me? Cold. I don't think I've ever touched such cold hair. Is there snow in Tokyo yet? You remember what you said then, but you were wrong. Why else would anyone come to such a place in December? Then the danger of avalanches was over, and the season for climbing mountains in the spring green had come. Presently the new sprouts would be gone from the table. Shimamura, who lived a life of idleness, found that he tended to lose his honesty with himself, and he frequently went out alone into the mountains to recover something of it. He had come down to the hot spring village after 7 days in the border range. He asked to have a geisha called. Unfortunately, however, there was a celebration that day in honour of the opening of a new road, the maid said. So lively a celebration that the town's combined cocoon warehouse and theatre had been taken over, and the 12 or 13 geisha had more than enough to keep them busy. The girl who lived at the music teacher's might come, though. She sometimes helped at parties, but she would have gone home after no more than 1 or 2 dances. As Shimamura questioned her, the maid told him more about the girl at the music teacher's. The shamisen and dancing teacher had living with her a girl who was not a geisha, but who was sometimes asked to help at large parties. Since there was no young apprentice geisha in the town, and since most of the local geisha were at an age when they preferred not to have to dance, the services of the girl were much valued. She almost never came alone to entertain a guest at the inn, and yet she could not exactly be called an amateur. Such in general was the maid's story. An odd story, Shimamura said to himself, and dismissed the matter. An hour or so later, however, the woman from the music teacher's came in with the maid. Shimamura brought himself up straight. The maid started to leave, but was called back by the woman. The impression the woman gave was a wonderfully clean and fresh one. It seemed to Shimamura that she must be clean to the hollows under her toes. So clean indeed did she seem that he wondered whether his eyes, back from looking at early summer in the mountains, might not be deceiving him. There was something about her manner of dress that suggested the geisha, but she did not have the trailing geisha skirts. On the contrary, she wore her soft, unlined summer kimono with an emphasis on careful propriety. The obi seemed expensive, out of keeping with the kimono, and it struck him as a little sad. The obi is the sash with which a kimono is tied. A woman's obi is wide and stiff, a man's narrower and usually softer. The maid slipped out as they started talking about the mountains. The woman was not very sure of the names of the mountains that could be seen from the inn, and since Shimamura did not feel the urge to drink that might have come to him in the company of an ordinary geisha, she began telling of her past in a surprisingly matter-of-fact way. She was born in the snow country, but she had been put under contract as a geisha in Tokyo. Presently, she found a patron who paid her debts for her and proposed to set her up as a dancing teacher, but unfortunately, a 1.5 years later, he died. When it came to the story of what had happened since, the story of what was nearest to her, she was less quick to tell her secrets. She said she was 19. Shimamura had taken her to be 21 or 22, and since he assumed that she was not lying, the knowledge that she had aged beyond her years gave him for the first time a little of the ease he expected to feel with a geisha. When they began talking of the kabuki, he found that she knew more about actors and styles than he did. She talked on feverishly, as though she had been starved for someone who would listen to her, and presently began to show an ease and abandon that revealed her to be at heart a woman of the pleasure quarters after all. And she seemed in general to know what there was to know about men. Shimamura, however, had labelled her an amateur, and after a week in the mountains during which he had spoken to almost no one, he found himself longing for a companion. It was therefore friendship more than anything else that he felt for the woman. His response to the mountains had extended itself to cover her. On her way to the bath the next afternoon, she left her towel and soap in the hall and came in to talk to him. She'd barely taken a seat when he asked her to call him a geisha. "Call you a geisha? You know what I mean." I didn't come to be asked that. She stood up abruptly and went over to the window, her face reddening as she looked out at the mountains. There are no women like that here. Don't be silly. It's the truth. She turned sharply to face him and sat down on the windowsill. No one forces a geisha to do what she doesn't want to. It's entirely up to the geisha herself. That's one service the inn won't provide for you. Go ahead. Try calling someone and talking to her yourself if you want to. You call someone for me. Why do you expect me to do that? I'm thinking of you as a friend. That's why I've behaved so well. And this is what you call being a friend? Led on by his manner, she'd become engagingly childlike, but a moment later she burst out, Isn't it fine that you think you can ask me a thing like that? What is there to be so excited about? I'm too healthy after a week in the mountains, that's all. I keep having the wrong ideas. I can't even sit here talking to you the way I'd like to. The woman was silent, her eyes on the floor. Shimamura had come to a point where he knew he was only parading his masculine shamelessness, and yet it seemed likely enough that the woman was familiar with the failing and need not be shocked by it. He looked at her. Perhaps it was the rich lashes of the downcast eyes that made her face seem warm and sensuous. She shook her head very slightly, and again a faint blush spread over her face. Call any geisha you like. But isn't that exactly what I'm asking you to do? I've never been here before, and I've no idea what geisha are the best looking. What do you consider good looking? Someone young. You're less apt to make mistakes when they're young. And someone who doesn't talk too much. Clean and not too quick. When I want someone to talk to, I can talk to you. I'll not come again. Don't be foolish. I said I'll not come again. Why should I come again? But haven't I told you, it's exactly because I want to be friends with you that I've behaved so well. You've said enough. Suppose I were to go too far with you. Very probably from tomorrow I wouldn't want to talk to you. I couldn't stand the sight of you. I've had to come into the mountains to want to talk to people again, and I've left you alone so that I can talk to you. And what about yourself? You can't be too careful with travellers. That's true. Of course it is. Think of yourself. If it were a woman you objected to, you wouldn't want to see me afterwards. It would be much better for her to be a woman you picked out. I don't want to be here anymore. She turned sharply away, but presently she added, I suppose there's something in what you say. An affair of the moment, no more. Nothing beautiful about it. You know that it couldn't last. That's true. It's this way with everyone who comes here. This is a hot spring, and people are here for a day or two and then gone. Her manner was remarkably open. The transition had been almost too abrupt. The guests are mostly travellers. I'm still just a child myself, but I've listened to all the talk. The guest who doesn't say he's fond of you, and yet you somehow know is, he's the one you have pleasant memories of. You don't forget him, even long after he's left you, they say. And he's the one you get letters from. She stood up from the window sill and took a seat on the mat below it. She seemed to be living in the past, and yet she seemed to be very near Shimamura. Her voice carried such a note of immediate feeling that he felt a little guilty, as though he had deceived her too easily. He had not been lying, though. To him, this woman was an amateur. His desire for a woman was not of a sort to make him want this particular woman. It was something to be taken care of lightly and with no sense of guilt. This woman was too clean. From the moment he saw her, he had separated this woman and the other in his mind. Then, too, he had been trying to decide where he would go to escape the summer heat, and it occurred to him that he could bring his family to this mountain hot spring. The woman, being fortunately an amateur, would be a good companion for his wife. He might even have his wife take dancing lessons to keep her from getting bored. He was quite serious about it. He said he felt only friendship for the woman, but he had his reasons for thus stepping into shallow water without taking the final plunge. And something like that evening mirror was no doubt at work here too. He disliked the thought of drawn-out complications from an affair with a woman whose position was so ambiguous. But beyond that, he saw her as somehow unreal, like the woman's face in that evening mirror. Okay, I'm going to stop the stream there this is the first part of Snow Country, and I hope to continue it within the next few days. So I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know in the comments what you thought. Okay, there we go. So this is Gray from Wakizashi's Teahouse signing off for the night, and I hope to see you in a future video.